Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. This podcast is, chapter 2 of Noam Chomsky's and Edward Herman's book, Turning the Tide, U.S., the Washington Connection, and Third World Fascism. It's the Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 1, and it is an excellent book about the United States government's mass murder campaign and fascist installment of, sub-fascist, colonial, murderous butcher state across the world. We discuss many countries in this book. The chapter 2 is the Pentagon CIA archipelago. Archipelago being an island, a group of islands that is being, masterminded by the racist thugs of the American government. So we're gonna, get started. And again, the Google Drive link will be available on my website at, the website address will be placed. So, hopefully you'll be able to follow along and, read the book. I strongly recommend you read this book because it is an excellent book and it will provide you with, excellent, information, media, all that stuff. So let's get started. The United States white bestial butchers can be seen in their amount of aid offered to fascist regimes with human rights murderous abuses. The U.S. government offered more aid to the Brazilian, Chilean, Dominican, Guatemalan, Indonesian, Filipino, and Iranian regimes in 1974 compared with other regimes. The common feature of the fascist regimes of the white racist American butchers was that those regimes had a high incidence of electric shock to the genitals, arm amputations and bleeding, leg amputations and bleeding, disembowelment, drowning of children and infants, and the spinal neck cracking. Its paramilitary forces undertook extensive training in the United States under the auspices of the United States White Congress. This aid, when evaluated, is an important factor in the spread of fascism in these regimes. Fascism, to understand simply, is the racist perception that one who is not white or an agent of a white capitalist is not worthy of education, life, or any other rights. This presents a problem for a population of 300 million. There may be a handful, say 25, that the U.S. government pays large sums of money for maintenance of fascist programs, in addition to lavish prostitution, drugs, and alcohol. However, the other 99% of the population is unable to have meals and starves. Education isn't even considered. The U.S. government ensures that the client fascist states bomb and destroy the books, libraries, and murder the scholars execution style. One can see that the murderous American butchers of white Congress and president promote the destruction of the societies due to their heavy reliance on fascism and human rights murder to ensure proper profits for their white capitalist frauds. But it doesn't stop here. This is just the sugar plantations, the oil resources, the natural resources, and the textile, and other great things that these lands hold. The white capitalist frauds rape and plunder these lands and murder to ensure their profits are maintained. But then their U.S. media does brainwashing, quote unquote, in the name of freedom. These are fascist client states, and there is no freedom in these societies. Yet the media outlets of the New York Times and Washington Post are racist frauds and say that these U.S.-funded white dictatorships are looking for freedom for the Hispanic, Black, and Asian people. That is like saying the Confederates were looking for freedom for the Southern Blacks. American academia, including Ivy League institutions like Harvard and Yale, are intricately intertwined with U.S. congressionalist murderous regimes in these fascist colonial butcher states. These academia, in combination with intertwined right-wing think tanks like Rand Corporation, Hoover Institution, Hudson Institute, and academic social science scholarship, show that the democratic and national people of these lands are evil and we are good, though we have an occasional mistake. This is fraudulent white deliberate fabrication. There is no way that we as America are good if we amputate children's arms and infants' legs of Hispanics, Blacks, and Asians. Who is the white racist of the US Congress to decide if the nationalists who want to control the birthright privileges of these lands is evil? This is a white fraud American. All of these concepts come under the heading of American mass media and academic frauds, quote unquote, brainwashing under freedom. So in summary, the angry white vigilante bestial butchers of the American government export racist torture, support murder, and no education for third world peoples, making America a racist land of white fascists. So let's get started. Pentagon CIA archipelago. The Vietnam War has been digested in the U.S. political system with hardly a trace. Essentially, the same people manage national affairs and possess virtually exclusive access to the mass media. The critics of the war have lapsed or have been forced into silence, and the media have not allowed the vast accumulation of sordid details about our Vietnam involvement to disturb the myth of U.S. benevolence and concerned pursuit of democracy abroad. This myth has remained unruffled even in the face of accelerating Brazilianization of the third world over the past several decades, very often under active U.S. sponsorship, with frequent displacement of democratic governments and extensive and growing resort to repression, including physical torture, imprisonment, death squads, and mysterious quote-unquote disappearances, all within the U.S. sphere of influence. At the end of World War II, if some precise commentator had described the terror regimes that now dominate Latin America, liberals would have derided the visionary for spelling out likely consequences of a Nazi victory. Such liberal critics would have been right, although liberation has accommodated well and has contributed much to the institutionalization of sub-fascism under U.S. tutelage. In this context, the state sponsored and supported the Somoza family, the Shah, Marcos, Park, Pinochet, Suharto, Mobutu, the Brazilian generals, and their many confederates on repression and violence can announce a campaign for human rights through the world and be taken with utmost seriousness. Neocolonialism and the Washington connection. Since World War II, there has been a steady deterioration of political and social conditions in Latin America and generally throughout third world areas that are within the free world. Liberal ideologists treat this as fortuitous and independent of United States choice and power, claiming that as democracy, we support democratic institutions abroad, while any contrary trends are based on exogenous forces over which the United States has no control. In the process, it is necessary to suppress and belittle the long-standing relations between U.S. political military elite and the military juntas and comprador elements in such states as Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, the economic advantages of the third world fascism to U.S. economic interests, and the evidence of positive U.S. political and economic support for brutal dictatorships and frequent hostility to reform, as well as radical change in the third world. The systematic, positive relationship between United States aid and human rights abuse. The real relationships, as opposed to the standard ideologic expressions of devotion to democracy and humanism, are indicated on the accompanying table, which relates U.S. economic and military aid and that of U.S.-dominated international lending agencies to various political and human rights and economic factors. The table focuses on a series of strategic changes whose dates are shown in column 1 for 10 U.S. client countries. Columns 2 to 4 describe the effect of these events on the political environment and human rights, with minus sign indicating adverse effect on human rights, decline on democratic institutions, and also an increased use of torture and large numbers of political prisoners, and positive sign the reverse. Column 5 shows the effect of these events on the climate of investment. 5A shows positive if tax and profit repatriation laws were eased. 5B is if positive government controls were put on wages of independent labor organizations were weakened or destroyed. Columns 6 to 10 show percentage changes in aid and credits from the United States and international organizations for the 2 or 3 years after the political change as compared with the comparable period prior to the events. For example, under Brazil, 1964 is a strategic date, as noted in column 1. We can see that human rights deteriorated, investment climate improved, and overall aid and credit by the U.S. and multinational lending corporations went up 112% in the 3 years following the coup as compared to the 3 years preceding the coup. There are a number of problems associated with this table. Trends in torture and numbers of political prisoners are not easy to establish, and in a few instances, the evidence is tentative. Aid figures can also be misleading, as other factors may temporarily distort a relationship. For example, a decline in aid to South Korea after the Park coup of 1972 was greatly influenced by the withdrawal of South Korean mercenaries from South Vietnam and the resultant decline in U.S. payments for the hired soldiers. The reduction in military aid to Chile after the fascist coup of 1973 is also misleading, since the high rate of military aid under Allende reflected U.S. support for the right-wing military in the interest of the counter-revolution. Economic aid to the civil society declined precipitously under Allende. The collapse of international rights organizational aid to Chile during the Allende period and its rapid recovery under fascism reflects the dominance of U.S. economic and political interests in the decision-making process of the international agencies. For all its limitation, the table bears out on graphic form a set of relationships that should be obvious to any student of recent Third World history. For most of the sample countries, U.S.-controlled aid has been positively related to investment climate and inversely related to the maintenance of democratic order, democracy, and human rights. Only in the case of South Korea and Thailand is the pattern reversed. The South Korean exception we have explained above. The row for Thailand shows a sharp reduction of U.S. economic and military aid following the moves towards democratic government in October 1973, slightly more than offered by U.S. international organization credits. But the bulk of the credits consisted of large World Bank loan made in 1974 while control of the Thai elite was still intact. In 1975, World Bank loans fell to zero for the first time in a decade. It also should be noted there was a large influx of military aid into Thailand in 1976, not shown in the table, which no doubt facilitated the counter-revolutionary coup of October 1976. Each of the 10 countries shown on Table 1 was a major violator of human rights during the past decade, but each received military, economic aid, and police training assistance from the United States in the 1970s. For a slightly different group of 10 free world violators of human rights, Table 2 shows for the 5-year period 1973 to 1978 that the 10 received total economic aid from the United States of over $2 billion, along with military aid and credit of $2.3 billion. They were sold arms in excess of $18 billion, and they had 12,723 officer trainees at schools in the United States or in U.S. bases abroad. The table also shows that 7 of the 10 violators were proposed recipients of military grants and credits in the Carter, quote-unquote, human rights program budget for fiscal year 1978. The author of the Table 2, Michael Clare, concludes that rather than standing in detached judgment over the spread of repression abroad, the United States stands at the supply end of a pipeline of repressive, murderous technology extending to many of the world's authoritarian governments. And despite everything this administration has said about human rights, there is no evidence that this pipeline is being dismantled. In fact, its relative durability suggests that the delivery of repressive technologies into the authoritarian regimes abroad is a consistent and intentional project of our foreign policy, rather than a peripheral or accidental one. U.S. military aid and police and aid and training in the spread of fascism. Military training and supply and buildup and cultivation of the military and intelligence establishments, as well as CIA surveillance and destabilization, have been key elements of the Washington Connection, quote unquote, employed to protect U.S. interests in its client states in the post-World War II era. The United States trains client military personnel in some 150 bases and training schools and send mobile units and advisors to serve on an in-country basis. This training has placed a great weight on ideologic conditioning and has steeped young Latin officers in the early 1950s anti-communist dogma that subversive infiltrators could be anywhere. In addition to the ideologic cement of this worldview, U.S. military training has purposefully helped build a network of personal relationships between the United States and Latin American military cadres. This tie has been further consolidated by military aid from the wealthier power, as well as cooperative maneuvers and logistic planning. Over 200,000 Latin American military personnel have been trained in the United States, and since 1949, over 35,000 Latin American officers have trained in the School for the Americas alone, a school identified in Latin America by its historic function as, quote, the School of Coups. In testimony before Congress, there has been a pretense by spokesmen for the military and foreign policy establishment that our training and contacts will have pro-democratic interests and will serve to bring on more human rights methods to the Latin American police and military. Precisely the opposite effects have occurred. Our training and aid have enhanced the power of the military, and our ideologic and moral support and training have encouraged them to assert themselves politically. They have become more pro-American, quote unquote. But any spin-off of democratic values is as yet undetectable. In the Brazilian coup, the U.S.-trained faction took the lead in overturning constitutional government, and throughout Latin America, graduates of U.S. military training, including Pinochet and Ley of Chile, Geisel of Brazil, Massera of Argentina, and scores of others, have led to the march to sub-fascism. Furthermore, inhumane methods of interrogation and general mistreatment of prisoners has grown steadily. In parallel with the increase in U.S. training and supply of modern tools of repression, Amnesty International report on torture report on torture pointed out today, much of state torture is carried out by the military forces, usually elite or special units, who displace the civil police in matters of political security. Their military training and their post-World War II theories about unconventional war make them particularly apt for the practice and enable them to apply the concept of war to any situation of civil political conflict, no matter how mild. From Brazil, and with continuing U.S. assistance, torture spread throughout much of Latin America in the 1960s and early 1970s, with Brazil serving as a torture aid subcontractor of the United States. Jean-Pierre Clavel states that secret steps were taken in Brazil in the early 1960s by a group of senior military and police officials to create a coordinated autonomous torture and death squad network to crush political opposition. To train personnel, illustrated lectures and live demonstrations of torture were conducted using political prisoners as guinea pigs, or Operacio Bandeirantes, once described as a type of advanced school of torture. Subsequently, trained Brazilian torturers traveled to military academies in neighboring nations to conduct torture in what euphemistically they called interrogation. Clavel notes that refinements have continued based on programs of technical and medical research designed to develop techniques for intensifying pain without causing death. He quotes Dr. Timothy Shallis of London National Hospital. Torture, which was once a craft, has become a technology. Brazil is apparently not the only subcontractor for torture aid. In a series of reports from Iran, Richard Sale commented that innumerable Iranians, including many in a position to know, told me that Israelis oversee Savak's technique, which have been reported by Amnesty International and others in gruesome detail. The creativity of U.S. specialists in this area has been impressive. A Vietnamese prisoner in South Vietnam remembered a visit to the U.S. prison by U.S. prison experts. Usually we were chained in a kind of ordinary shackle in the form of number 8, where the legs and hands go through the 2 holes of the number 8. Then one day, 3 Americans came and inspected the shackles and chains. A couple of days later, the number 8 cuffs were replaced with the new ones. Whenever the prisoners tried to move their legs, the fetters would lock further and further one step and yet another step through them. During the Vietnam War, the United States supplied funds and technology for tiger cages, interrogation centers, and electronic and other equipment used for torture. And at a very minimum, the United States gave the moral sanction itself for the huge expansion of torture as a standard practice. SAVAK, the Iranian secret police, noted for its sadism and frequent use of torture, was set up by the CIA in 1957, and the military officers who ran it from its inception received special training at Marine Base in Quantico, Virginia, and attended orientation programs at CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia. More SAVAK agents received U.S. training under police programs financed by the Agency for International Development, and which spent more than $2 million on public safety. Jan Black notes that in Brazil, the marked expansion of police training programs also coincided with an increase in undocumented reports of the systematic torture of political prisoners and of the murders and petty criminals, as well as alleged subversives carried out by the quote-unquote death squads, reportedly composed of off-duty policemen. There is considerable evidence that U.S. military and intelligence services have provided training in torture to third world police and military. But this is of a small consequence given the established fact of moral American support. Massive supply of torture technology and the widespread adoption of torture as an administrative practice by client fascist states to so supplied and protected by the United States. The Amnesty International report on torture provides an excellent case study of the history of torture under Colonel's regime in Greece, 1967 to 1973, noting that, quote, American policy on the torture question, as expressed in an official statement and official testimony, has been to deny in where possible and minimize it where denial was not possible. This policy flowed naturally from the general support for the military regime. This generalization could be applied to the system of torture regimes. We will show many cases below, and it tells us a great deal about the ultimate source of this cancerous growth. So you can see the U.S. government, for third world people, for their, client fascist, colonial butcher states, they were okay with torture, right? Is the U.S. Congress okay with torture of its whites in prisons? No, they're not okay with the torture of their whites in prisons because they're racist, white, hypocritical frauds. They're white frauds of the American government, and that's why they're not okay. Or are they okay with their torture of, anyone in their prisons? Only third world peoples. Only third world peoples get tortured in American prisons. So the key is they are racist, angry, vigilante, white, butcher frauds. The scope and variety of CIA subversive activities. CIA destabilization operations have assumed many forms, of which only a few will be mentioned briefly here. First is the outright murder of political leaders like Lumumba to be replaced by the more amenable Mobutu or General Schneider in Chile, and the numerous attempts on the life of Castro. Second, and also familiar, are the direct conspiracies with terrorists, mercenaries, or usually military factions within a country to disrupt or overthrow a government in disfavor. Among the more conspicuous and acknowledged successes with heavy CIA involvement have been the Belgian Congo, Chile, Greece, Guatemala, Indonesia, and Iran. Among the failures, the abortive 1958 rebellion in Indonesia and the Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1961. In the case of Laos, the CIA actually organized and directed a mercenary army of hill tribesmen in an effort to destroy the indigenous social revolution, cynically abandoning its protégés when they were largely decimated and no longer needed. In this general category, we may also note such activities as terrorist attacks, crop poisoning, etc., as practiced extensively by the CIA under Kennedy and subsequent administrations in an effort to undermine the Cuban regime and disrupt Cuban economic development. The total number of cases of CIA involvement in active subversion of established governments and attempts at political murder runs into the hundreds or even thousands. Third is political bribery and the funding of foreign politicians. In the case of Brazil, the inflow of CIA money in the pre-1964 period was so huge, involving so many hundreds of politicians, that it provoked a scandal and a government investigation, which was conveniently terminated by the 1964 coup. Fourth is propaganda, which can take a wide variety of forms, but is invariably undercover and thus dishonest to its sources, and is often carried out by subsidies to researchers, research institutes, publishers, and journalists. It can be massive in scale and scope, as in pre-coup Brazil, where in 1962 the CIA mounted a saturation campaign with 80 weekly radio programs, 300 additional hours of radio TV advertising, a flooding of the press with canned editorials and information, quote unquote, large quantities of billboard ads and pamphlets, etc. It kept, quote, dozens of journalists on its payroll and edited a monthly magazine using top quality paper and free distribution. It even rented the editorial page of Rio's evening paper, A Noite, and it subsidized the publication of numerous conservative books distributed free and without attribution. In its propaganda campaign, the CIA has long engaged in forgeries designated to discredit its enemies. In Brazil, for example, in order to undercut the position of a peasant leader threatening reform, the CIA printed leaflets announcing his presence at non-existent meetings and printed Marxist literature to be distributed after the coup to prove the existence of a communist threat. In Chile, the CIA forged the disseminated documents of 1973 to prove that the communists intended a bloody coup featuring the beheading of the top echelons of the military, in part to frighten and provoke the military into pushing ahead with their own takeover and massacre. A fifth type of CIA destabilization program is the organization and funding of demonstrations, but important in the subversion process in both Brazil and Chile. Philip Ages noted in the diary that the Rio station and its larger bases were financing the mass urban demonstrations against the Goulart government, proving the old themes of God, country, family, and liberty to be effective as ever. The same tactic was employed in Chile as part of the CIA subversion program. A sixth CIA tactic is the infiltration of favored organizations and political parties. This has international value, and it allows confusion to be sown and agent provocateurs to function. In Brazil, the most important effort of this sort was implemented in collaboration with the AFL-CIO through the American Institute for Free Labor Development, which carried out an anti-communist propaganda campaign, worked diligently to split and discredit any independent Brazilian unions, and in the end proudly supported the coup that definitely ended free unionism in Brazil. Finally, the CIA collects information, which is used in various ways. Most interesting is the extent to which it regularly provides information to rightist thugs and conspirators against constitutional government. The Chilean military were given lists of enemies, and Brazilian rights were constantly fed information prior to the coup. The political orientation and role of the CIA are such that no clandestine agents were stationed in South Africa between 1974, while both before and after 1974, the CIA has had a close, cordial relationship, quote unquote, with the South African secret police. CIA destabilization of inconvenient democracies has been commonplace, but it takes a vivid imagination to conceive of them subverting South Africa in the interest of ending apartheid. Attention is focused above on Brazil precisely because it is such a large and relatively powerful country. In spite of this, the CIA was able to bribe its journalists, subsidize its politicians, conspire with military factions, infiltrate and subvert the labor movement, and engage in extensive propaganda campaign. In short, it could virtually disregard the sovereignty of this large and theoretically independent country. The catch, of course, is that Brazil was not an independent country. U.S. penetration of Brazil was already enormous in the 1960s, and United States leaders acted as if they had a veto over Brazilian economic, democratic, and foreign policy. The Brazilian military and much of its economy were already denationalized, with strong ties and dependency relations to the United States, and U.S. business had a substantial presence in Brazil, controlling, among other things, about half of the advertising industry and a rapidly expanding and significant fraction of the mass media. It was hard to separate business and CIA activities in Brazil before 1964. Levinson and the Onus claimed that U.S. business, in close touch with the CIA, helped organize and finance anti-Goulart demonstration in the early 1960s, and Richard Helms himself reported that business served regularly as a CIA cover. Hanna Mining not only funded anti-communist conferences, but made a more direct defense of freedom by providing trucks for the Minas Gerais troops that launched the revolution. A curious aspect of this massive subversion operation in a country such as Brazil is that it is not regarded as subversion. If the Cubans are found to provide weapons to insurgents in Venezuela, such a discovery is given great publicity as evidence of Cuban perfidy. This puddling and one-dimensional effort is subversion. The subversion of Brazil by the United States in the years leading to the coup of 1964, weapons on a huge scale, bribery, black propaganda, practically open conspiracy with military officers, massive institutional subversion, and multidimensional effort in the natural right of power where domination is taken for granted, that the hegemonic power intervenes by inevitable and unquestioned authority. We are benevolently protecting our children in their own interest so that parents can be considered alien to their children or conspire against them. Can the cat looking after the 20-mile mice have an interest antagonistic to theirs? So just give me 1 second. I'm going to just take a little break. I'm just going to take a 15-second break. I have to make a lighting adjustment. Glad you could join us. Okay, so I'm just going to make a couple comments. So you can see the CIA, the United States government, the CIA, democracy, forgeries. We do forgeries, just, open deception. I mean, the U.S. government is an open group of white fraud deceivers. They are racist, angry vigilante butchers. And, they openly deceive people. They quash democracy. They bribe politicians. They bribe, the military. They, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars sending, perks to military elite. And, those military elite have the guns to murder the people. So the U.S. government is a bunch of white, racist, anti-third world butchers. Continuing on, 2.14, the preeminence of favorable investment climate. The pattern in the exercise of power by the cat among the mice is clear, persistent, rational, and ugly. Human rights have tended to stand in the way of the satisfactory pursuit of U.S. economic interests, and they have accordingly been brushed aside systematically. U.S. economic interests in the third world have dictated a policy of containing revolution, preserving an open door for U.S. investment, and ensuring favorable conditions of investment. Reformist efforts to improve the lot of the poor and oppressed, including the encouragement of independent trade unions, are not conducive to a favorable climate of investment. Democracy is clearly not conducive to a favorable business climate. As noted by Edward A. Jesser, a chairman of the United Jersey Banks, in a speech to the American Bankers Association, quick and tough decisions can be made in a relatively short time in a country such as Brazil compared to the difficulty there is in reaching an agreement on what actions are taken in a quote-unquote democracy. So much for democracy. Democratic threats to the interests of foreign investors, such as Philippine Supreme Court ruling prior to 1972 coup, prohibiting foreigners from owning land, or Brazilian dispute over a mineral concession to Hanna Mining Company, or agrarian reform in Guatemala, or nationalization of oil in Iran, are expeditiously involved in favor of the foreigner by dictators and military juntas. Marcos, for example, quickly reversed the land ownership decision and, quote, according to one oilman, Marcos says, quote, we'll pass the laws you need. Just tell us what you want. This is a nice illustration of how under client or colonial fascism, the constituency of the leadership shifts to foreign interests. This case exemplifies what has been a consistent pattern. The economic role of terror, preserving and enlarging military comprador and foreign income shares. We have seen that there is a positive relationship between U.S. aid, investment climate, and terror. A grim further fact is that terror is not a fortuitous spin-off, but as a functional relationship to investment climate. Special tax privileges to foreign business and dependence on foreign investment for economic growth are not easy to achieve under a democratic order in the era of third world nationalism. Neither are wage controls and other actions conducive to favorable investment climates. These actions have involved the deliberate marginalization of over 80% of the population by their total exclusion from political processes, from legal and broader human rights, quote unquote, and from policy calculations of the elite leadership. The necessary linkages between terror and economic policy has been expressed time and again by spokesmen for the Catholic Church in Latin America, for whom the connection is a part of daily experience. The situation provoked by the chosen model of development is such that, in effect, provokes a revolution that did not exist. In order to impose the model of development which gives privilege to small minorities, it was necessary to create or maintain a repressive state, which in turn provokes a situation of civil war. The very theoreticians of the system insist on the necessary link between development and security. They recognize that the development they wish to impose on the country can only provoke indignation among the people. If there were any type of freedom left, the cries of protest would be so great that the only solution has been to impose absolute silence. Okay, so you give me a second. I'm going to take a 1-minute break. I'll be right back. Glad you could join us. Okay, so continuing on. In short, the new order, quote unquote, in the U.S. colonial sphere is blatant and violent class warfare, with the combined interest of the denationalized military leadership, some local business, and multinational enterprise, with its foreign state adjuncts literally seizing the state to accomplish their objectives, shattering the organizational defenses of the majority of the population and striving to render it passivity, clearing the decks for sub-fascist economic policy and development. The economics of sub-fascism involves a rapid shift to wide open door to foreign trade and investment, tight money, and social welfare budget cuts. That is, the economic policies called out by the interest of the dominant power and its institutional affiliates, the IMF and World Bank. Priority is given to servicing the foreign debt via increased exports and decreased imports, with the burden falling largely on the underlying population in the form of reduced wages and serious unemployment. There is a return to the free market, quote unquote, theory, but it is selectively applied with no serious control over monopoly power, employer organizations, and collective action, but with control over wages, both directly and by means of banning of strikes and the destruction of state control of unions. Deflationary policies and an open door tend to weaken domestic business and enhance the power of foreign companies that can borrow abroad at relatively low interest rates. Thus, foreign investment often takes the form of buying out non-competitive local businesses in an accelerated process of denationalization. Takeovers are financed commonly with resources raised in the poorer country, either in local capital markets or through reinvested local earnings. A 1968 Brazilian Commission of Inquiry study, suppressed in Brazil, showed that over an extended time period, 11 major multinationals had brought into Brazil only $300 million in capital from the outside. They had reinvested $693 million and remitted about $745 million. The ratio of surplus generated by these companies in Brazil to the capital they had brought in was 5-1. Although the Brazilian state has become more active in economic affairs in the 1970s, the coup increased the dependence of that country on foreign capital, which controls some 50% of Brazilian manufacturing sales and 59 of the 100 largest manufacturing companies, dominating the motor vehicle, pharmaceutical, machinery, rubber, plastic, and other industries of strategic importance. In Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, the early client fascist years have been characterized by a massive displacement of smaller domestic firms by larger local and, more importantly, foreign multinationals. A persistent and crucial characteristic of neocolonialism is the preservation of labor as a cheap commodity. In the Philippines, for example, real wages have declined sharply for both rural and urban workers. And in an era of rising commodity prices, labor remains the cheapest component. Manila remains one of the few capitals of the world where a taxi ride from the airport to the center of the city costs less than $1 with tip. Plantation labor in the Philippines in the mid-1970s was 10 cents an hour, quote unquote, and in industrial park of Bataan, averaged 85 cents a day. Not enough for minimal nutrition apart from other human necessities, but superb for the United States in keeping labor costs at attractive levels. The 1972 agricultural census of Brazil showed that 78% of the rural workers of Brazil earned less than 150 cruzeiros, about $38 per month. This enormous and impoverished reserve army is kept unorganized by the force, educated by neglect, and constantly replenished by state encouragement and subsidizing of rural agribusiness mechanization. Still lower wages have been obtainable by the use of prison labor. In Colombia, for example, where the minimum wage in 1975 was $1.33 per day, Container Corporation of America, B.F. Goodrich, and dozens of other companies have employed thousands of prisoners at still lower rates under programs put forward as rehabilitation, quote unquote. Although 75% or more of the prisoners have never been tried but are caught up in the Colombian system of justice. Cheap labor is, of course, good for keeping down business expenses, but doesn't it limit the scope of the market for goods to be sold? The answer is that neo-colonial economies are increasingly export-oriented, with a heavy emphasis on the export of raw materials so that the mass of the population can be regarded by its leaders as merely a cost factor. In a famous 1973 statement signed by 6 Brazilian bishops and widely discussed outside of the United States, the role of exports is described as follows. We must export. Many industrial and agricultural companies are formed for the purpose of export. They have credit tax incentives and other advantages so that they can export. Why? To earn money to stabilize our balance of payments, etc. But could not the same objective be reached with an increase in the internal market? In Brazil, only 5% can buy what is produced with credits. About 15% of the working class can purchase a little above their basic needs. The other 80% practically buy nothing other than what they need to keep them from dying. Why? Because the economy is not based on the people, but rather on a moneyed minority funded by the United States. Thus, the thing is to export. They try to export everything they cannot sell here at home. that which the people cannot afford to buy. It is not only a matter of luxury goods, for example. We are exporting shoes. In 1974, 1975, exports will account for 1/3 of our production of footwear. And here our people go barefoot and will go barefoot. And meat exports. Is there too much meat on our tables? Export guarantee financing and the profits of corporations, pure and simple. The perspective of the U.S. business community on marginalization, repression, and related matters was illustrated in a 1976 special report by Business Week on reversal policy. Latin America opens the door to foreign investment again. The editors are positively ecstatic about these new developments. The report is studied with such terms as pragmatic, quote unquote, realistic, stability, tough, and confident. The words, quote unquote, democracy and quote unquote torture do not appear in the special report, nor is there any discussion of trends in income distribution or the allocation of budgetary resources to arms business subsidies and education and medical research. The word quote unquote repression appears once in the following context. The unifying theme of Latin American military governments is that they stand or claim to stand for social and economic progress, not just law and order. Faced with a choice, however, they are likely to postpone social improvement as a goal secondary to economic consolidation and political stability, imposed with varying degrees of repression. A new unifying theme is that the juntas claim to stand for social progress, but they may not get around to it in our time. These muddled apologetics exhaust Business Week's analysis of welfare, income distribution, and political trends in Latin America. Business Week is quite pleased with Chile, whose economy has been reduced to shambles by Allende. No mention of the CIA ITT contribution. Fascist achievements have been obscured by a deep recession and by harsh austerity measures. Industrial output fell marginally under Allende, whereas the index went from 113 to 78 under the Pinochet junta. Apologetics can hardly be more crass and incompetent. The important point, though, is that a magazine that represents quote-unquote enlightened U.S. business interests displays such unqualified enthusiasm for third world fascism, based clearly on its favorable impact on U.S. businesses. Any adverse effect on the majority of the population are completely irrelevant. So I'm going to just make a point here so you can see the U.S. business interests, their cash, is, for fascism, for repressive regimes, for butcherous murders of the United States, the white butchers of the American government. And you can see 78 cents a day is what the Filipinos were making, 50 cents a day, $38 a month was what the Brazilians were making. This is what you get. The U.S. government makes, $1 million of, 5 minutes on the labor and backs of the people who run those systems. And, the peasants in those countries end up making less. So the U.S. government, a bunch of racist, white, fraud, deceptive liars and thieves. There is also a convergence of economic and military strategic interests in support of third world fascism, as the military juntas in charge usually have a client relationship to the U.S. military establishment, are cooperative on U.S. bases, and specialize in the cleaning up of any subversion and protesters who challenge the satellite relationship. The military strategic interest may have some small degree of autonomy of its own, but the size, role, and global spread of the U.S. military establishment cannot be explained with any degree of plausibility, except as derivative from the global economic interest that is well understood by the strategists of containment. In light of the role of client fascism is as a system of institutionalized class repression and warfare, it is little wonder that the income share of the top 5% of income receiving units of Brazil rose from 44% in 1960 to 50% in 1970, and that the share of the poorest 80% fell from 35% to 27.5%, and that only the top 10% of the population increased its relative income share. The Gini coefficient, a widely used measure of income inequality, reached its highest national level ever recorded in Latin America in Brazil in 1970. According to Business Week, the real wages of the lowest 80% of the Brazilian population have been steadily dropping since 1964, the year The generals took over despite a tripling of the gross national product to $80 billion. In 1971, 65% of Brazil's economically active population subsisted on a monthly income of $60 or less. And only 1% earned $350 per month and over, but many of these earned $5,000 a month or more. It's in entire provinces of Brazil, the average income is under 10%, and that of other provinces, hunger in the northeast, has taken on the characteristic of an epidemic. And undernourishment not only kills large numbers of infants and small children, half the children born in northeast Brazil die before 5, but has contributed to an alarming rate of feeble-mindedness among those who remain. Just as in Thu's South Vietnam, so in Brazil, very high-quality medical services is available in the larger cities for the upper 5% of income-receiving units, but negligible medical resources are available in the countryside. Vastly more resources are applied to the police than to medical research and facilities, although Northeast Brazil, whose 35 million residents form the greatest concentration of poverty in Latin America, is a virtual human laboratory for third-world animals. The serious disease, schistosomiasis, is very widespread in Brazil. The fatal disorder Chagas affects 500,000 people. 30,000 new cases of tuberculosis appear each year, and contagious diseases account for 22% of all deaths. Nonetheless, the Ministry of Health's share of the national budget fell from 4.29% in 1966 to 0.99% in 1974. On the other hand, the allocation for defense tripled in real terms between 1963 and 1973. Clearly, the new Brazil, so pleasing to Business Week and the U.S. business community, is not exactly a welfare state. The large majority of the population is a means, not an end, in the same class as pack animals, only more dangerous, needing regular doses of terror to maintain stability. Terror keeps the neo-colonial elites in power and the investment skies sunny. The victims are numerous, but can be disregarded because of their remoteness and passivity. If necessary, we can blame them for their own laziness and excessive production of offspring. In their study, Economic Growth and Social Equity in Developing Countries, Irma Edelman and Cynthia Taft-Morris state that the results of our analysis came as a shock to us. We had shared the prevailing view among economists that economic growth was economically beneficial to most nations. We had also not greatly questioned the relevance today of the historical association of successful economic growth with the spread of parliamentary democracy. Our results proved to be at variance with our preconceptions. On the basis of elaborate analysis of data for 43 less developed countries, they found that the position of the poorest 60% typically worsens both relatively and absolutely when an initial spurt of narrowly based dualistic growth is imposed on an agrarian substance economy. The gains of the top 5% are particularly great in very low-income countries where the sharply dualistic nature is associated with political and economic domination by traditional or expatriate elites. These elites need any growth dividend to meet a rising international consumption standard and the needs of the external constituency, so that with sufficient force at their command, they and their allies may capture all surpluses and depress even further the real incomes of the masses, frequently via inflation in the context of police state control over money wages. Edelman and Morris found socio-political factors to be of great importance in explaining cross-country differences in income distribution in case after case. Quote, the more firmly entrenched the expatriate financial, commercial, and technical elites, the greater the concentration of income in the hands of the top 5%, and broad-based economic growth provides a way to achieve redistribution only when accompanied by social and educational development, as well as substantial broadening of political participation. In brief, then, income distribution has tended to worsen in poorer countries of the free world because growth has generated wealth that has been used not to improve the condition of the masses, but to serve the growing consumption needs of the neo-colonial butcher elite and the demands of foreign businesses and finances of the U.S. government. The preservation of the position has required the costly diversion of resources into the military, the insurance policy, quote unquote, and a subordination of development and welfare needs to the consumption demands of the U.S. fraud capitalists, open door entrants, and affluent domestic consumers. Suharto, Marcos, etc., all have in common institutionalized venality, terrorization of the masses, and service to the needs of the expatriate financial, commercial and technical elites, specified by Edelman and Morris as tied in closely with the worsening income distribution, counter-revolution, and the shakedown states. So remember, the book is going to be online. The book is going to be online. So just download the book. I strongly urge everyone to read the book. The military junta and dictators, sponsored and are supported by the United States, usually proclaim as one of their objectives the cleaning up of civilian and democratic corruption. But corruption is built in to these regimes and is normally carried to new heights when they achieve power. The graft and amassing of huge fortunes by the leadership of the collaborating elites have been so widespread that we may refer to them as shakedown states. This is not new. In the case of Chiang Kai-shek's Old China, General Stilwell's lengthy experience with the Kuomintang led him to the oft-expressed conclusion that they were simply gangsters, quote unquote, who believed, accurately it turned out, that they could go on milking the United States for money and munitions by using the old gang about quitting if not supported. As Coco remarks, no serious account of China during the colonial period 1942 to 1945 differs on the proposition that the corruption and venality of the ruling elite was its sole consistent characteristic. A study of $43 million in U.S. savings certificates and bonds put up for sale in October 1943 showed that the bulk was in the hands of the Kuomintang leaders. T.V. Soong held 4.4 million, K.P. Chen 4.1 million, H.H. Kung 1.4 million, and so forth. In the case of South Vietnam, huge fortunes were being made by comprador elements even before the escalation of 1965 brought in really large resources capable of being stolen. General Khan, leader of the South Vietnamese state by the U.S. choice for a brief period in 1964 to 1965, and an expatriate shortly thereafter, prided himself on his restraint in having built up an estate of only $10 million prior to his exit. A 1968 report on the Senate Subcommittee on Refugees stated that corruption pervades all aspects of Vietnamese life and it is brazenly practiced. Government jobs are bought and paid for by the people seeking a return on their investment. Police accept open bribes. Officials and their wives run operations in the black market. Aid funds and hospital supplies are divided into private corporate pockets. In the field of refugee care and in many other fields, the Thu government of North Vietnam has been engaged in the systematic looting of its own people. Strongly reminiscent of the Kuomintang, where the daily reports in 1974 to 1975 of the pocketing by Cambodians and South Vietnamese officers of the pay of quote-unquote phantom troops, or the rice rations of live refugees, and the stealing and smuggling of medicine, scrap metals, and military supplies. Each new jet fighter, were converted into ready money by the Saigon corruption machine. A 1976 police raid uncovering in an illegal scrap metal depot the wings of at least 15 A-37 aircraft, large numbers of which were rushed to Saigon just prior to the ceasefire at a cost to the U.S. taxpayer of $500,000 per airplane. In 1974, there was also a sensational scandal involving the siphoning off into speculative hoards of 150,000 tons of fertilizer, another gift of the U.S. taxpayer by a group of importers and officials, including Thu's brother-in-law, who sold it off later at a high black market price. The Philippines exhibits the same pattern. An early post-coup analysis in Business Week, in expressing skepticism on the likelihood of the Marcos would stamp out corruption, noted that the president and his close associates are hardly free from suspicion since taking office 7 years ago as a man of relatively moderate wealth. Marcos has become one of the Philippines' top 10 taxpayers in a country with its share of multimillionaires. That is not bad on his official salary of $4,500 a year. It is also well known that Marcos has demanded that he and his associates in the government be cut in on the profits of local business. Recent evidence indicates that the Marcos revolution against corruption has involved a transfer of wealth by expropriation from some old wealthy families out of favor with Marcos to Marcos's family and friends. The concentration of the flow of graft, undiminished in size, into the hands of a new elite, and the more aggressive use of state power to reward favored individuals, to destroy others, and to protect favored looters. Similar processes on a somewhat larger scale are discussed below in the cases studies of Thailand and Indonesia. In the U.S. view, all of this is treated as a rule of Asian nature, quote unquote. As pointed out by Donald Kirk, Far Eastern correspondent of the Chicago Tribune, quote, Kim, a South Korean poet, blames the suffering of his people in large part on the kind of bribery and chicanery that American officials smilingly dismiss as quote unquote routine among Asian peoples, notably those allied with the United States. Paul Strauss, a long-term U.S. financial correspondent in Asia, assures us that what we fail to realize is that corruption is a way of life in Asia, quote unquote, and that what is bad is not graft, but unsystemic graft, such as one finds in the Philippines, as compared with the efficient graft of South Korea, quote unquote. Actually, Strauss and U.S. officialdom are correct insofar as the quote unquote Asian nature, familiar and relevant to Americans, is of those willing to cooperate with the imperial racist powers in supporting revolutionary nationalism and maintaining free world control, what the Vietnamese call country selling, quote unquote, Asians. Peter Dale Scott quotes the Council of Foreign Relations document that refers to a certain Indonesian group as possessing rare qualities of leadership, which Scott observes includes the special characteristic their recently demonstrated willingness to plot with the CIA against a popularly elected and supported government. Asian nature and rare qualities of leadership are clearly often interchangeable expressions. We therefore expect to find the same characteristics in African nature, quote unquote, and Middle Eastern nations, quote unquote. The Zaire regions of Mobutu has replicated the Asian scene with the human nature and rare, quote unquote, rare qualities of leadership of Western choice. Michael Kaufman reports in the New York Times that Mobutu's system of patronage and payoffs has created an extortionate culture evident at all levels of society that has become increasingly oppressive. The president also said to have a huge portion of Swiss banks and residences abroad. What angers the Zairians more is the spread of the rapaciousness through every rank of the bureaucracy, particularly in the army. This is the regime which the West put into power initially and rushed frantically to preserve in power in 1978 with the aid of some traditional Cold War demagoguery and fabrications. Much of the loot carried away by the leaders of Zaire's shakedown state, as is so frequent throughout the United States empire of evil, is a straight donation by imperial agents of funds provided by the U.S. taxpayer. One recently publicized episode was the $1.4 million given to Mobutu by the CIA for distribution to U.S. applied counter-revolutionary groups in Angola. Mobutu simply pocketed the money. Middle Eastern human nature, as manifested in the CIA-produced regime of the Shah of Iran, repeats its familiar pattern, although oil wealth has made possible greater high-mindedness at the top and a partial slowing off of some of the cruder forms of grab. As in the Marcos case, the line between the interests of the state and the ruler is fuzzy. Expenditures of the imperial court of the Shah are provided for in the Iranian state budget, which in 1976 gave the Shah Among other incidentals, a discretionary fund of $1 billion. The Shah's personal assets are not published, but the Pahlavi Foundation, controlled by the Shah, owns property estimated as worth about $3 billion, and direct family holdings of land banks, insurance companies, hotels, and industrial companies runs the family of assets, total to unknown further large sums. Graft has long been endemic to the Shah's Iran, and in the 1950s there was a major scandal involving allegations of massive looting of U.S. aid and money by the Shah himself. The bribery revelations of recent years have pointed to the regular use of position by family and military insiders to expedite contracts at a fee. There have been periodic anti-corruption campaigns in Iran, the renewal of which indicates the nature of their success, the effect of vigorous anti-corruption campaigns starting in 1974, according to one foreign company official, quote, is that we now must pay to the people holding still higher positions in the country's hierarchy. In 1978, the Shah announced that members of the royal family would no longer be allowed to accept commissions and serve as intermediaries in contracting, suggesting that the family members, large numbers of the millionaires, are so conditioned as to find it difficult to keep their hands out of the till. The popular uprising of late 1978 led to new promises that now there would be reform. There are several compelling reasons for the pervasiveness of graft under client fascism. One of the most crucial is the power and nature of the interest of the support base, a privileged local elite and usually even more powerful foreign establishment. These interests expect rewards for their support or that of their government, and they have the power to exact their toll. Hanna Mining, in dispute with the democratic government of Brazil from 1956 to 1964 over mineral rights claims, was able to settle immediately after the coup on its own terms, gaining in addition exclusive harbor rights and other special privilege. In fact, every subversive overthrow of reformist and democratic governments in the United States sphere has been quickly followed by tax profit repatriation and mineral claims adjustment that reflect a reestablishment of the hegemonic authority and special privileges for U.S. corporate white fraud interests. A second and related factor in graft is the quality and ideology of the leadership of the various military juntas and dictatorships. Under U.S. auspices, the native leadership consisted of elite military and comprador elements who, in meeting United States criteria, will hardly possess any independent social vision relative to their own country or any basis or capacity to mobilize large numbers of their compatriots. As Malcolm Brown wrote about our Vietnamese, quote unquote, our Vietnamese in the early 1960s, some military officials, especially those who served in the Viet Minh in the war against the French and later switched to deem are excellent officials by any standards, but they are exceptions. Unfortunately, most of the really intelligent, dedicated, and patriotic men and women who form the stuff of sound leadership stayed with the Viet Minh. In the 1970s, the same situation holds for the general run of free world junta leaders, drawn from the same elite groups as Diem and Thu, standing in the same relation to their own population and an external power, and performing the same functions. Non-military dictators like Marcos tend to be crass and self-serving opportunists. The military leaders of the Third World who have allowed themselves to be mobilized in the crusade against communists, change threatening any reduction in privilege, have tended to be fanatical and naive, as well as opportunistic, not a healthy or inspiring combination. In brief, the support base of privilege and the entire network of arrangements, including the selection of leaders qualified to do the work to be done, makes corruption integral to the system. And general cynicism soon pervades the privileged in a shakedown state, as it is observed that the leadership is feathering its own nest, that the foreigner has special rights not available to the ordinary member of the club, and that privilege is arbitrarily structured with the local elite. Thus, graft tends to be spread horizontally and vertically among the military and other bureaucratic and elite members. And in this shakedown state, the government man, when questioned about his right to bribe a Latin American customer nation, points to his own pocket and says that it is the true resting place of the court of inquiry. This flows naturally from control by denationalized elites in a system of suspended law and arbitrary privilege. The members of the elite, who, awakening to their role, develop qualms about graft, national denationalization, and forcible repression, may find themselves cast in a role of subversives themselves and treated accordingly. The system of corruption has its own internal protections, since Democrats and reformers who oppose corruption and sympathize with the poor are a security threat and can be appropriately terminated as part of a system of preventive counter-subversion with the assistance of the CIA, U.S. police advisory groups, and the appropriate communications of torture technology. So I'm just going to make just a comment here. The U.S. government are racist white butchers and thieves. They steal the money from the third world peoples. They enslave them, then they murder them and torture them, and then they throw them into the river. That's the U.S. government, the angry bestial white savages of America. Okay, so I'm going to just take a 1-minute break. I'll be right back. We'll continue. There's only 14 pages left, so we'll be done, maybe in 45 minutes to an hour. Great, you could join us. Okay, so we're going to go through the U.S. capitalist corporate media frauds, brainwashing under freedom. Despite the clear link between United States sponsorship and support on the one hand, and the use of terror and serious human rights violations on the other, the nature and importance of the Washington connection, quote unquote, are generally ignored in the West, and the United States is regarded as in the vanguard of the defense of human rights. To some extent, this faith rests on the facile and still widely prevalent assumption that external misbehavior is closely related to internal repression and limitations on freedom of dissent. As should be obvious from the most cursory examinations of history, however, internal freedom is quite compatible with exploitative and inhumane external conduct extending over many decades. Even in the fountainhead of Western democracy, ancient Athens, the development of a military establishment, a naval fleet, quote, made Athens securely democratic and incurably aggressive. Moreover, the aggressiveness of the Athenian polis was enhanced when rowers' pay and plunder became, for a surprisingly large proportion of Athenian citizenry, a necessary or at least highly desirable addition to the family resources. Against this background, Athens' ruthless and incessant naval enterprise, which kept the entire Greek world in turmoil from 480 to 404 BC, becomes intelligible. The cruel plundering of India, China, and the East Indies and Africa by the relatively liberal and open societies of Western Europe from the 17th well into the 20th centuries also shows the internal freedom and long-term external viciousness of entirely compatible. So I'm going to read that sentence again. The cruel plundering of India, China, the East Indies, and Africa by the relatively liberal and open societies of Western Europe from the 17th well into the 20th centuries also shows that the internal freedom and long-term external viciousness are entirely compatible. More important, however, the neglect of the scope and significance of the Washington connection, quote unquote, is a testimonial to the greatly underrated capacities of what we may all call brainwashing under freedom, quote unquote. The ability of the system, that is to say, the important power factions in the system and their intellectual and media spokesmen to reconstruct and shape the perspectives of history and the interpretation of current events in accordance with its own interests is truly impressive. Just as slavery and institutionalized racism could be rationalized and reconciled with the idea of the United States as the land of whites, liberty, and equality of opportunity, opportunity, mainly by not looking to the Washington connection that with spreading third world terror can be reconciled with the white United States, keen on human rights, quote unquote, by a suitable combination of diversion, prevarication, and refusal to contemplate. To achieve this result without explicit government censorship is the genius of the Western racist way. The background against which human rights issues have arisen in the period since 1945 includes an unparalleled worldwide economic expansion by the United States, its establishment of a global military presence with a peak of over 3,000 foreign military bases, virtually surrounding both the Soviet Union and Communist China, and interventions in the affairs of other states that are unmatched in number, scale, violence, and global reach. In the face of these developments, the myth has been successfully established in the public mind and in liberal circles in Western Europe that the United States is, quote, just containing other expansionist powers, quote unquote. During the early phases of the Vietnam War, by a blatant misrepresentation of Lin Pao's call for people's war, quote unquote, suppressing his reiterated statement of the need to adhere to a policy of self-reliance on the strength of the masses in one's own country and by a general propaganda barrage. The Chinese were established by the mass media as expansionists, while the United States engaged in the wholesale destruction and racist occupation of distant small countries on the border of China with bases around China, and supporting Chang and Taiwan was responding to China's aggressiveness, preventing dominoes from falling, protecting freedom, etc. Rarely was the United States portrayed in the mass media or mainstream academic scholarship as engaged in the positive pursuit of its own economic imperialist interests at the expense of third world people standing in its way, nor are its exploits described as a subversion or outright aggression. The hypocrisy and sheer silliness of such political commentary in this regard is truly remarkable. At the outer limits of absurdity, we find the Wall Street Journal deriding the simple-minded myths that, quote, the problems of Indochina stem from things like American imperialism and its military-industrial complex in an editorial on August 31st, 1978. Such phrases as American imperialism, quote unquote, ordinarily under a strict taboo, are occasionally permitted in such contexts as these. Readers are carefully protected from exposure to any serious discussion of the concept of colonialism that arouses such horror. We were in Indochina not because of any U.S. material interest motivating a quote-unquote forward foreign policy, but as a matter of higher principle, exactly as when we aid and support Stroessner in Paraguay or the Shah in Iran. And it goes without saying that the U.S. military exploits or social engineering programs in Indochina could hardly be responsible for any current problems. To cite another example, William Shannon, liberal commentator for the New York Times and later President Carter's ambassador to the Republic of Ireland, laments the failure of United States policy in these terms. For a quarter century, the United States has been trying to do good, encourage political liberty, and promote social justice in the third world. But in Latin America, where we have traditionally been a friend and protector, and in Asia, where we have made the most painful sacrifices of our young men and our wealth, our relationship have mostly proved to be a recurring source of sorrow, waste, and tragedy. Even in Chile, he explains, our benevolence, quote unquote, intelligence and hard work have proved not to be enough as we intervene with the best of motives. We will be trapped in ironic paradoxes if we persist in our noble crusade to advance our moral ideals throughout the world. As these examples illustrate, self-deception and lying can reach quite extraordinary heights. Suppose that Fidel Castro had organized or participated in at least 8 assassination attempts against various presidents of the United States since 1959. It is safe to conclude that the New York Times, the racist fraud white media, CBS News, and the mass media in general would have portrayed him as an international gangster and assassin who must be excluded from the commentary of civilized nations. But when it is revealed that the United States has made or participated in that many murderous attempts on Castro's life, it's just one of those things that governments do. The press will hardly suggest, on the basis of such information, that the world's nations have to evaluate the U.S. potentiality as a responsible world citizen. To paraphrase a Christian Science Monitor editorial that had the gall to assert that the United States, after the record of the past 30 years, is entitled to stand in judgment over Vietnam for its violations and war crimes and violations of human rights. Suppose further that Fidel Castro had arranged for his agents in the United States to disperse various disease carriers in agricultural regions in an attempt to position and destroy livestock and crops. Can one imagine the hysteria of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times on the depths of which barbaric evil can sink under communism? The United States actually did carry out such attacks against Cuba, reported in the process in early 1977 as minor news items. 500,000 pigs had been destroyed in Cuba as a result of deliberately spread viral disease and biological warfare by the United States. And according to a recent statement of a Canadian advisor to the Cuban government, as early as 1962, he was paid $5,000 by a Defense Intelligence Agency representative to infect Cuban poultry with a viral disease. Editorial outrage has been modest, to say the least. President Carter has offered to move toward normalizing relations with Cuba, but under conditions that are worth presenting in his own words. I can be convinced that Cuba wants to remove their aggravating influence from other countries in this hemisphere, will not participate in violence in nations across the oceans, will recommit the former relationship that existed in Cuba towards human rights, then I would be willing to move toward normalizing relations with Cuba as well. It is Cuba that must cease its aggravating influence in this hemisphere and refrain from the U.S. force on international affairs if normal relations are to be established. Not the superpower that has instituted sub-fascist regimes throughout the hemisphere and pounded the countries of Indochina to dust, among other recent exploits. But even put that aside, 8 admitted attempts on Castro's life, a sponsored invasion, innumerable acts of sabotage, and still Carter can talk about Cuba's external violence and not be challenged or ridiculed by anyone whose voice can be heard. Carter's reference to the state of civil rights in Cuba under the Batista dictatorship, to which he urges that Cuba should recommit itself, also elicited neither criticism nor satire. Where such hypocrisy and distortion can pass without comment, it is evident that the mass media are maintaining a system of thought control which can establish and nourish the big American lie as effectively as any system of state censorship. All of this may be regarded as commonplace. In any society, apologists will seek to portray external ventures in a favorable light, and the force of nationalism assures that their view prevails. Nevertheless, despite massive evidence to the contrary, liberal and social democratic opinion in the United States and Western Europe continues to regard the United States as an exception, a country of which ideas flow freely and without discrimination, and where the truth wins out over falsehood, Vietnam and Watergate. The myth is reinforced by material success and power, which have helped generate a high degree of self-righteousness and respect, and it is promulgated by an enormous propaganda and deception apparatus that tends to dominate the domestic and international flow of information. Power has also meant innumerable links and dependency relations with elites throughout the world, and thus strong psychological and interest pressures influencing them to perceive issues from the viewpoint of the U.S. leadership. The British Labour government's consistent support for the U.S. assault on Vietnam, with only the mildest admonitions and occasional foot dragging, represents the typical governmental and leadership response outside the communist world. The Swedish government's open and sharp criticism was virtually unique in the free press, despite an unprovoked aggression of extraordinary savagery by the United States. U.S. beneficence and good intentions are presumptions that sustain self-righteousness and self-deception at home. So I'm going to make a short comment here. The white media are frauds. The white media, New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, all of the U.S. mass media are frauds. They're white frauds. They are deceivers. They are liars. They're propagandists. They are a state disinformation campaign meant to make the United States look like angels when they are mass murdering, sadistic white butchers. Brainwashing under freedom, sources and processes. One of our main concerns in this work is the process of brainwashing under freedom, as manifested in the selection analysis of issues by the media and the relationship of such practice to human rights, to U.S. economic and political interests, and to truthfulness. We will not attempt to unravel the detailed mechanisms of thought control, for example, the mechanisms by which editors decide what to publish and how to present it, but rather the general principles to which their practice conforms. We focus on the fact, for example, that the mass media bewail the fate of Cambodian victims of communist terror on an almost daily basis, while entirely ignoring or rationalizing Indonesian massacres in East Timor, which, on the basis of evidence, no less fearsome. Let me read that sentence again. We focus on the fact, for example, that the mass media bewail the fate of Cambodian victims of communist terror on an almost daily basis, while entirely ignoring or rationalizing Indonesian massacres in East Timor, which are on the on the available evidence no less fearsome and are being perpetrated in the course of unprovoked aggression, considered to be a serious matter since Nuremberg, and are carried out with U.S. weapons and de facto support. The most extreme claims regarding Cambodian violence are immediately given credence and extensive publicity, and even if proven false, are with insignificant exceptions, not correctable in the mass media. We note in contrast that as regards East Timor, when the mass media on rare occasions touch gingerly on the subject, the facts offered are not only often false, but are also regularly skewed in the direction of apologetics for Indonesian terror, exactly in accord with the U.S. government propaganda deception line. We will also review in detail how the mass media systematically ignore, deny, or construct apologetics for sub-fascist terror, in striking contrast to their techniques with regard to the communist enemy. An interesting methodologic counterpart of this dichotomous treatment is that in regard to the states to be treated negatively post-war Indochina, refugees or other victims are taken as the primary or exclusive source of information, even when other sources are available, and neither the selection of refugee testimony, the circumstances under which it is obtained, or the credibility or bias of those transmitting these version of this testimony is subjected to critical analysis, whereas in the case of sub-fascist clients, Indonesia and East Timor, Guatemala, Brazil, etc., the victims of terror are almost entirely disregarded as sources of information, and the official administering the terror or the public relations services are relied upon for the facts. The pattern is, to be sure, a very familiar one, and one of the most striking illustrations of the effectiveness of the process of brainwashing under freedom is that the obvious truth is so rarely perceived. The pattern just described, which we will illustrate in considerable detail below, is just what we will find in the totalitarian states, where conformity is ensured by the application or threat of force. We are not surprised to discover, for example, that the Soviet press is indignant over the actions of the CIA and U.S. corporations in Chile, or over U.S. atrocities in Vietnam, while it finds that Russian intervention in Hungary or Czechoslovakia is an expression of the solidarity of the Russian people and their workers' state with the tolling masses who are defending themselves against CIA fascist plots. And if Ethiopia attempts to suppress Eritrean liberation forces and violence and terror during the period when it is a Soviet client, one would hardly expect to find an indignant factual account in Pravda. While all of this is obvious in the case of a totalitarian state, replication of a similar pattern in the free press passes without notice in the West, an indication of a form of convergence, quote unquote, between the major socioeconomic systems that is a bit different from those sometimes discussed. As regards both Indochina and the sub-fascist states, line is discernible in the U.S. media, and to a significant extent throughout the free world. Indochina is subject to regular, almost daily attention, focusing with laser-like intensity on terror and oppression. In keeping with preoccupation, we find a gravitation to the most inflated estimates of repression and violence as stripping away of the crucial historic context, a high moral tone, and non-correctability or falsification and error. The line with regard to the U.S. client fascist state is just the reverse. Only episodic attention, de-emphasis of terror, and avoidance of the human effects of sub-fascist processes, understatement of the facts concerning state violence, stress on GNP abstracted from human consequence of a rise in GNP under sub-fascist conditions, and on alleged or promised improvements and the correctability of error if it is hostile to the sub-fascist state. Thus, for each case of a class of cases, the volume of information, the tone, the emphasis, and the interpretation are loaded with bias in favor of the doctrinal system preferred by those with power, and they function to implant in the public mind selected truths with all the effectiveness of a system of government censorship. The quote-unquote line dispensed in this fashion by the free press conforms well to the economic interests of the U.S. multinational corporations and other large interests of dominant social groups. Cambodia, for example, is a communist state. A focus on Cambodian terrorism, carefully extricated from the relevant historical context, serves important U.S. interests by allowing a strong ideologic point to be scored against radicalism, socialism, egalitarian ideals, and the danger of third world nationalism. Socialist terror, real or fabricated for the occasion, is useful, a fact that may help explain why distortion and fact creation are permissible and uncorrectable. Cambodian terror also diverts attention away from the terror and violence that have been growing by leaps and bounds throughout the entire sub-fascist empire. Thus, communist terror is positively and urgently needed as a diversion and to show that while we may be awful, they are worse. Pained outcries about human rights violations in East Timor, Indonesia, Brazil, or Uruguay, while incomparably more significant in actually helping to relieve human suffering than the focus of communist inequity, would upset U.S. business white fraud bankers and military intelligence and government racist officials who are not only pleased with sub-fascism, but whose interests explain active U.S. sponsorship and support for it. Mass media selectivity, suppressions, exaggerations, and sometimes plain lying are thus subject to an entirely rational explanation in terms of primary systemic interest, whatever may be the precise mechanics whereby the system's line is implicated. Alternative views and analyses are available in the United States in fringe media that reach a minuscule sector of the population, probably less than 1%. Thus, the line that Vietnam has now solely a land of woes, refugees and would-be refugees, victimized by cruel oppressors, not a country suffering from the legacy of U.S. violence, is the virtually uncontested portrayal in the New York Times, daily circulation over 800,000, and enormous influence beyond, as well as in less reputable but even more widely circulated publications such as Reader's Digest, circulation of over 18 million in the U.S. alone, and TV Guide, circulation over 19 million. In contrast, a visiting Quaker delegation, including Vietnamese-speaking relief workers with long experience in Indochina, gains no access to the mass media, though its members are free to report their perception of a nation attempting to rebuild from the wreckage of U.S. war in New England piecework, a monthly circulation of 2,500. On Cambodia and East Timor, while the mass media adhere to an almost undeviating line, the balance is righted by some excellent coverage in the International Bulletin, circulation 6,000, and dissidents who expose press fabrications are, on rare occasions, permitted a letter to the editor. Typically, reports that emphasize the destruction caused by the United States' racist actions in Indochina, or the effects and commitment of the victims to reach a tiny cycle of peace activists. Reports that ignore the U.S. role and find only woes and distress attributed exclusively to communist villainy reach a mass audience and become part of the established truth. Facts contrary to the line are available in the mass media in small, isolated doses lacking context, and may be culled out by the assiduous reader aware of the overwhelming built-in bias. where powerful domestic interests are at odds over an issue, Nixon and Watergate, or to a lesser extent Vietnam, there may be no uniform line, or the line may be subject to a fair amount of undercutting in the mass media. These deviations, mostly small, but occasionally substantial, are important and valuable, and they help make a so-called free press, quote unquote, in a wealthy society considerably better than a state-censored press, as does the sheer volume of news. But the adulation, including self-adulation, of the free press has long neglected the extent to which it also follows a party line, especially on foreign affairs where the interests that shape policy are powerful and without any substantial internal opposition. Because it is not censored by the state, the free press enjoys an aura of even-handedness and dedicated pursuit of truth, an illusion, and a dangerous one, as we shall document throughout this work, especially where the issues involve substantial U.S. economic and political interests and relationships with friendly or hostile states. The mass media usually function in the manner of state propaganda and deception agencies, and their pronouncements should be treated accordingly. The impact of economic and political interests and power on the mechanics of mass media processing of the news is complicated and can only be summarized briefly here. One factor is ownership interests. Mass media enterprises are big business. Many of them are now divisions of conglomerates with a wide variety of activities, including a production and sale of weapons. Westinghouse, RCA, GE, and General Tire and Rubber, and their owners and managers share the interests and values of their business peers. They are an important part of an elite group that benefits from the status quo and plays a crucial role in the selection of editors and other key personnel, in policy criteria, and in fixing the practical possibilities of news selection. Advertisers are also important in the mass media, and the need to attract and maintain good relationships with them helps define the limits of tolerable controversy. Sponsors and media together want to produce an output that will help sell goods, will not seriously disturb any substantial consuming group, and will be ideologically and politically compatible with the business system and the multinationals that increasingly dominate mass media advertising. On television, the news itself is easily overrated in importance for ideology and attitude formation in comparison with the commercial and entertainment messages that combine dramatic intensity and uniformity of ideologic substance. The action drama spy series of the immediate pre-Vietnam War era continuing throughout the war gave an ideologic underpinning to the U.S. intervention. Especially the FBI espionage series featuring an omnipresent communist threat all quickly acquired sponsors and set the tone, excitement, and patriotism. Freedom Crusade. Exciting entertainment provides the escape route, seemingly unrelated yet subtly supportive of what was being done. The drama could have meaning only if its viewers accepted consciously or unconsciously its underlying premise that we quote unquote faced enemies so evil and so clever that the intricate means used to defeat them are necessary. News reporting proper only rarely upsets the supportive tone fixed by the more important commercial entertainment avenues, but it hardly could, given the dominance of the government and business in news supply and the underlying involvement in U.S. global efforts. The relationship between newsmen and business leaders was described by Walter Cronkite himself, considered one of the more critical members of the fraternity, as symbiotic. He observed that newspapers, broadcasting networks, and outlets survive on the advertising revenues that come from business. Journalism can thrive only as long as the business community remains healthy enough to provide funds. Business, on the other hand, depends on journalism to foster its own growth. Through the dissemination of information, through the news and advertising, because of this symbiotic relationship, media efforts that focus on matters which business does not want discussed are rare. Wage rates and labor conditions in the Dominican Republic, or the use of police torture in states offering excellent opportunities to U.S. business, such as the Philippines and Brazil, or regular and in-depth treatment of occupational diseases. Such efforts would involve serious potential costs and conflict and lost goodwill. Documentaries on such subjects would not sell well. Since all of this is understood in advance, self-censorship causes them not to be prepared in the first place. The government is another potent factor that mass media businesses must treat with care. It is an important source of news, has power in many spheres, and even directly regulates TV and radio mass firms. The mass media find it in their self-interest to portray government actions in a favorable light. On foreign affairs, the government and business interests are major sources of news, and if their policies and interests are such that the daily murder of dissidents in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and Guatemala is not only irrelevant but tends to discredit friendly regimes, they will not supply such information to the media and will even regard any featuring of such facts as offensive and contrary to the national interest. The highly concentrated wire services are also closely linked to the United States government, business, and the mass media, and they are sensitive to the national interest as seen by dominant power groups. They are also tied in important ways to foreign governments in the U.S. sphere of influence, depending on them for news, and as buyers of wire service copy local media, including government operation stations and papers. Thus, the wire process will tend not to seek out abuses of individual rights in Brazil or the Dominican Republic, even if quite severe, but will concentrate instead on Palestinian terror and Soviet and Cambodian violations of human rights. When Richard Aarons and Survival International tried to interest the U.S. wire services and media and the destruction of the Paraguayan Achi Indians, they found no response. The stories and plenty of punch that would be highly salable. We believed the atrocities had occurred in an enemy state, but Paraguay is friendly and a responsive, racist, quiet state which grants ready access and privileges to U.S. corporate interests. Hence, the State Department consistently downplays its abuses. No significant interest groups in the United States are troubled by a final solution for the Indians of Paraguay. The lines followed by the free press thus seem to be readily explained as a function of the structure of U.S. interest and power that feed to the media selection process at many levels. No central authority tells the mass media to lay off the Indonesian assault on East Timor or the daily abductions and murders of sub-fascist Latin American states. It is sufficient and occasional editorial boldness in dealing with these off-the-agenda matters could well result in a significant flack from the government officials, interested businessmen, or representatives of the terror states. Normally, self-censorship does the job. Self-censorship conducted within the journal or station by the news selectors who have developed a free feel for the line and who can identify and excise hot items ready to generate too much negative reaction upstairs from the important people outside. News reporters and columnists also develop a feel for what is acceptable, and self-censorship thus occurs at their level on the basis of a learned and understood limits of subject matter, tone balance, and the like. A failure of self-censor on the part of reporters will result in a production of an unused copy, as well as the loss of goodwill at the top in the face of such irresponsibility. Several people concerned with U.S.-backed massacres in East Timor, for example, have informed us that reporters did write stories that were highly newsworthy by the standards of professional journalism. But when these reporters found that such material was not going to be published, they simply stopped writing on this taboo topic. We have discovered in our own experience a different device that the media use to ensure that the unspeakable is not spoken. Thus, journals refute to publish material on East Timor or on the media suppression of the ongoing massacres on the grounds that it is not a story that will interest people since no one has heard of it. Cambodian atrocities, in contrast, are an interesting story because they are in spotlight of world attention. Thus, a feedback process operates to ensure that the public remains properly indoctrinated. The process is set off in the right direction at the initiative of one or several of the perhaps dozen giant mass media enterprises, Reader's Digest, Time, NBC, New York Times, or the U.S. government, which by themselves are easily able to focus on spotlight of attention on some worthy subject. Even liberal commentators rarely focus on the systematic character of U.S. support for right-wing terrorist regimes and the simple economic logic of this quote-unquote Washington connection. This evasion may even be said to define the limits of permissible liberalism in the mass media. One may occasionally denounce torture in Chile and death squads in Brazil, but it is unacceptable to explain them as a result of official United States colonial policy and preference and as plausibly linked to U.S. economic interests. And it would be highly advisable, even when merely denouncing sub-fascist terror, to show balance by denouncing Soviet and left terror in equally vigorous terms. Otherwise, your days are numbered in those parts of the media that reach 99% of the U.S. population. Likewise, liberals are under such ideologic pressure that when Sharansky or Ginsburg trial comes along, or an alleged communist massacre, they hop onto the bandwagon with relief of their eagerness to rejoin their fellow citizens in the mainstream. Needless to say, a similar balance is not required of establishment and extreme right-wing commentators. Only one rarely finds any criticism of Gulag Archipelago for balance as a picture of Soviet society and its evolution, let alone for the neglect of unpleasant aspects of the free world. An amusing feature of the current U.S. media scene is that Soviet dissidents can publish almost at will in the New York Times op-ed column and receive publicity via press conferences, while U.S. dissidents have lost the limited access available to them at the height of the Vietnam War and are frozen out unless they wish to petition for the rights of victims of communism. The 99% of the population unreachable by U.S. dissidents are subject to the selective processes of the mass media that do not allow serious criticism of patriotic myths and untruths, with a brainwashing effect comparable to that of systems of explicit government censorship. So I'm going to make just a few comments. The U.S. is a white racist mafia state. It's a mafia state run by the racist, butcher, genocidal, murderous butchers of the United States government and supported by the racist, fraud, capitalist mafia, mafia executors in the corporate media. They just deliberately lie. They deceive. They censor. It's called government censorship and, American government butchery. The case of the lost bloodbath, the supply of demand for communist atrocities. If we ask, for example, what the U.S. public has been allowed to learn about the bloodbath that Nixon, Rockefeller, Douglas Pike, Patrick Honey, and the mass media in general portrayed as virtually certain result of a communist victory in South Vietnam, the answer must be that the post-1975 media suppressions and distortions neatly complement the deception on violence during the war that made these predictions plausible. Since the bloodbath threat, there was an important rationale for intervention and was reiterated time and again by our leaders. It might be expected that in the interest of the alleged victims that we were saving, the media would have followed closely and reported on this matter. Also, public education might be thought to require follow-ups on the solemn predictions on this subject by political leaders, experts, and editorialists. This is not the case, however. There has been no bloodbath so far, and as is known, nothing like what happened in France in 1944 after the Germans were expelled, for example, despite the long and horrendous provocations. See Volume 2, Chapters 2 and 4. But this remarkable fact and the reconciliatory behavior of the Vietnamese communists, which is unusual by historical standards, as we shall see in Volume 2, has been acknowledged grudgingly, if at all, in the small print of news reports. There have been few, if any, editorials pointing out the striking contrast between the behavior of the U.S. clients in Indonesia and Chile, for example, although the motives for revenge in Vietnam contrast with the official forecast and the long portrayal of the enemy as barbarians bent on mass murder on the one hand and the currently available facts on the lost bloodbath on the other. On the contrary, it is not unusual to describe the the post-war situation in Vietnam as if there had indeed been unprecedented retribution and atrocities. As we have pointed out, and we will examine at length in the next volume, the promised Vietnam bloodbath not having materialized, the mass media have found a new haven and basis for humanistic concern in communist Cambodia. An important virtue of Cambodia from the standpoint of the mass media serviceability is that information is not only sparse, but also dominated by reports of refugees, which are often selected and transmitted by sources of limited credibility and extreme ideologic bias. The limited and controlled information also facilitates the standard technique of attributing the communist iniquity, all suffering, troubles, and debts arising from a complex of causes, one of them being the quickly forgotten U.S. devastation and killing from 1969, particularly in the 1973 saturation bombing. Many people have been murdered and oppressed by the communist regime and its cadres since its triumph in 1975. But the distortions and exaggerations on the part of the Western media in a search for a nefarious bloodbath have reached staggering proportions, and as we shall show in detail, demonstrate it as clearly as any topic considered in this study, the workings of the free press as a system of deceptive propaganda. The mass media take communist atrocities where they can find them and invent them when they cannot, since such atrocities serve as useful educational quote-unquote purpose, bringing the community together in support of a vast and growing military budget and whatever new imperial ventures the political leadership wishes to pursue. The veracity of the allegations is irrelevant. Even if ultimately proven to be fabrications, these proofs can be disregarded and a useful lie can be institutionalized by reiteration and suppression. See Chapter 5 below and Volume 2 for many examples. The same is true of false predictions. To cite only innumerable examples, the Wall Street Journal published a forecast by former CIA analyst Samuel Adams that 100,000 people would be murdered in the event of a communist victory in Vietnam, which relied heavily on a hysterical propaganda track by Craig Hosmer, put out by the Rand Corporation. The journal refused at the time to publish any criticism of the Adam piece and has subsequently never gotten around to discussing where the Adams forecast went wrong. For readers of the journal, the Vietnamese communists might be said to have killed 100,000 people in a post-war bloodbath, an Asian Auschwitz. See Notes 109, Chapter 2. It is one of the public functions of both right-wing and official think tanks like Rand Corporation, the Hoover Institution, the Hudson Institute, the academic social science scholarship more broadly, to show that they are evil and we are good, though we occasionally err. A liberal acknowledges that we also have flaws. A conservative tends to neglect ours entirely. But for both communist flaws and bloodshed, the front and center, the matter of the communist essence, while such Western defects may be noted and deplored, are aberrations. A Max Lerner, for example, treats the human rights issue as a potential plus for the United States. His premise is an explicit Cold War chauvinism that defines the United States as the force of good in the world, which can strengthen its world position by this vehicle. Lerner will not discuss the U.S. role in violations of civil rights in the Third World, or even address the question of our disproportionate focus on civil rights east of the Elbe. Lerner would no doubt like the United States to pursue freedom instead of propping up little tyrants and torturers all over the world. But if our leaders choose otherwise, a quote-unquote responsible liberal will not explore the systematic factors involved and will pretend that people who do apply normal canons of rationality to U.S. policies and their origins must be either, quote, apologists for communism or otherwise outside the spectrum of tolerable discussion. The media are only one component of the general system of indoctrination and thought control. A fuller description of the processes of brainwashing under freedom would explore the schools and universities as well. When the media want an expert opinion on some topic of current interest, they naturally turn to academic specialists in that area. And then the state propaganda system is generally well served by this device. The academic professions rarely stray from the orthodoxy in interpreting matters of sensitive concern for private power. Like the media, academic scholarship is in general cautiously refrains from analytical investigation of U.S. foreign policy and its roots in domestic power. Crucial documentation that illuminates these issues is simply placed under a ban, for example, with a high-level planning studies of the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department during World War II. Relations, dangerous topics such as the role of corporate interests in foreign policy are studiously avoided as if under taboo. Young scholars who might wish to undertake a systematic and rational analysis of the nature and exercise of U.S. power and its domestic determinants are steered in other directions, made to understand that there is little future in this direction. A network of pressure, including grants, promotions, access to external state and private power, class interests, the comforts, prestige, and privilege that are natural concomitants of what Hans Morgan once called our conformist subservience to those in power. All of these factors and others combine to provide an intellectual milieu in which few serious questions will be raised about sensitive issues. Those who may nevertheless choose to raise and pursue them can either be weeded out if they are young and unprotected, or simply ignored or dismissed as unreasonable, quote unquote. Much as the organized religion in the period of its dominance could insulate itself from unworthy thoughts. In such ways, the doctrinal system is constructed that is responsive to the demands of the establishment. Questions that will be serviceable to its interests are intensively explored, while potentially embarrassing topics are put aside, and state and private power are protected from critical scrutiny. The doctrinal system that evolves in this way is available to be sampled by journalists and commentators who have their own reasons to keep close to the party line, quote unquote. We have not discussed other crucial elements of the system of brainwashing under freedom. For example, the organized and quite extensive efforts of business to control the contents of school curricula on sensitive topics, or to manage the flow of news directly through the mechanisms of what specialists in public relations call the engineering of consent, quote unquote. Nor have we attempted to elaborate the network of shared associations, class solidarity, common educational background, social contact, and status, etc., that link elite groups in the private economy, the state publishing, the news corporation, the university, and the professions. These two are major factors in helping to create a worldview that is protective of established power and that insulates it from unwelcome inquiry. A fuller investigation of these questions would also consider the occasional exercise of brute force when needed as a technique for undermining and disrupting radical tendencies or popular movements, even those with aims that are within the theoretical basis of shared beliefs, such as the civil rights movement. A fuller study would also explore the historical roots of a U.S. system of indoctrination in an immigrant society that by a unique combination of natural advantages was, for a long period, able to offer a share in expanding wealth and power to those who were willing to toe the line. The topics barely noted here are also rarely investigated within the framework of orthodox opinion that dominates the academic world, the schools, the mass media, and the outlook of the great mass of the population, which has little opportunity to inquire into its character and limits. So excellent book, The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism, Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman, The Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 1. Excellent book. So I'm going to just make a few comments on the last and put my closing remarks, and then we're done. It's 2 hours, an excellent time. Glad you could join us. So basically, in summary, the U.S. government are a bunch of mass murdering racist butchers. They, terrorize third world countries with, fascist regimes. The few U.S. business capitalist white frauds that run the money, make sure their money are protected, and they murder the people in the community. They murder the citizens of the country. And the U.S. mass media are racist frauds. They are deceivers. They are state propagandists. They are deliberate liars, and they are frauds. So it is a mafia enterprise, a racist mafia enterprise of the U.S. government and its media and its academia. So we're going to finish. Again, Edward Herman. You can find my book, The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism. You can find it on my description section, and I hope you can, enjoy it at that time. So I'm going to just finish with some closing remarks, and then we'll be done. It's 1 hour, 50 minutes. So we completed Chapter 2 in Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman books, Washington Connection and Third World Fascism. This is entitled The Pentagon CIA Archipelago. The United States white bestial butchers can be seen in their amount of aid offered to fascist regimes with human rights murderous abuses. The U.S. government offered more aid to the Brazilian, Chilean, Dominican, Guatemalan, Indonesian, Philippine, and Iranian regimes compared with other regimes. The common feature of the fascist regimes of the white racist American butchers was that the regimes had a high incidence of electric shock to the genitals, arm amputations and bleeding, leg amputations and bleeding, disembowelment, drowning of children and infants, and the spinal neck cracking. Its paramilitary forces undertook extensive training in the United States under the auspices of the United States White Congress. This aid, when evaluated, is an important factor in the spread of fascism in these regimes. Fascism, to understand simply, is the racist perception that one who is not white or an agent of a white capitalist is not worthy of education, life, or any other rights. This presents a problem for a population of 300 million. There may be 25, a handful, that the U.S. government pays large sums of money for maintenance of fascist programs, in addition to lavish prostitution, drugs, and alcohol. However, the other 99% of the population is unable to have meals and starves to death. Education isn't even considered. The U.S. government ensures that the client fascist states bomb and destroy the books, libraries, and murder the professors and scholars execution style. One can see that the murderous American butchers of the American Congress and President promote the destruction of these societies due to their heavy reliance on fascism and human rights murder to ensure proper quote-unquote profits for their white capitalist frauds. But it doesn't stop here. This is just the sugar plantations, the oil resource, the natural resources, and the textile, and the other great things that these lands hold. The white capitalist frauds rape and plunder these lands and then murder to ensure profits. But then their U.S. media does brainwashing in the name of freedom. These are fascist clients, and there is no freedom in these societies. Yet the media outlets of the New York Times and Washington Post are racist white frauds and say that these U.S.-funded white dictatorships are looking for freedom for the Hispanic, Black, and Asian people. That is saying that the Confederates were looking for freedom of the Southern blacks. American academia, including big Ivy League institutions like Harvard and Yale, are intricately intertwined with U.S. congressional murderous regimes in these fascist colonial states. These academia, in combination with intertwined right-wing think tanks like Rand Corporation, Hoover Institution, Hudson Institute, and academic social science university scholarships, show that the democratic and national people of these lands are evil and we are good, though we have the occasional mistake. This is fraudulent, white, deliberate fabrication. There is no way that we as America are good if we, quote unquote, amputate children's arms and infants' legs of Hispanic, Black, and Asian peoples. Who is the white racist of the American Congress to decide if the nationalists who want to control the birthright privileges of these lands is evil? This is a white group of frauds. All of these concepts come under the heading of American mass media and academic frauds. Quote, brainwashing under freedom. So in summary, the angry white vigilante bestial butchers of the American government export racist torture, support murder, and no education for third world peoples, making America a racist land of fascist whites. So we finished. Again, I strongly urge you to download this book and read it. It is an invaluable resource. It was 2 hours, perfect timing. I'll be back again tomorrow. I'll be doing half of chapter 3. It's called Benign Terror. It's going to take about 4 hours in total because it's, double the length. So hope you can enjoy it. Glad you could come. Hopefully you'll come next time. All of my notes will be in the description section. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.